Likewise, salam alaikum, everybody. My name is Ahmed Mohammed. I'm the trial attorney here in the national office in Washington, D.C., and we're really excited to get started. What we're going to be talking about today is knowing your rights in the workplace and at school if you have children during the month of Ramadan, right? There's going to be some special challenges that come up during this month, and so we want to do our best to kind of prepare you. Before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of general information about CAIR. CAIR is the Council on American Islamic Relations. We're the largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization in the country. We have chapters in over 25 states. Sahara is in one of those states in California. And our work includes protecting and defending the constitutional rights of all American Muslims in the country. That includes your right to practice your religion, your right to be free from discrimination, and that includes, major challenges to, government policies, especially policies that are being administered by, the Trump administration that's challenging the Muslim ban, challenging and trying to end the watch list programs. But as everybody probably already knows, CAIR does a lot more than just legal work. We do government affairs, which is organizing the community around political issues. We have a great communications team to make sure that, positive contributions that American Muslims are making are being spotlighted. And of course, next week we are publishing our civil rights report entitled Targeted, focusing on the anti-Muslim bias and hate incidents around the country. Make sure to go to CAIR.com on Monday and download your version. But today we're going to be focusing on religious accommodations in the workplace. And Sarah, can you kind of give us the logistics and how things will work out today?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Zahra Bilou. I'm a civil rights attorney and the executive director of the Bay Area office of CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. You know that because you're tuned in with us. We pride ourselves on being the oldest CAIR chapter in the country. So they first opened the DC office, and then they opened our office. No surprise if you're wondering where you want to buy your next home. You can't afford one in the Bay Area. It is absurd to live out here. But we are the most progressive region in the country, so it makes sense that CAIR came here after going to DC. We're excited to be doing this webinar with you. We know that Ramadan is just a few weeks out. If you're like me, you're scrambling to get in your makeup fast before that time runs out, and you should have done it in December when the days are short, but you're struggling because it's April and the days are long, but that's good preparation. In addition to preparing by making up your fasts and getting in the zone for fasting over a long, hard summer, we want to talk to you about what your rights are in the workplace. So today we'll be talking through some questions about, hey, what accommodations can you get in the workplace? What's the process? And what's reasonable, right? So we'll go through some of those questions. We're here on Facebook for the next hour or so. If you have questions throughout the conversation, feel free to put them in the chat box. Some of our colleagues are going to go through the questions and make sure that Ahmed and I can do our best to answer them. That said, if you have specific questions about your job, your situation, and you need specific help about your situation, please don't put that question in the chat box. You will waive your right to any confidentiality in consulting with attorneys if you put it on a CAIR National chat box where thousands of people can see it. So if you need that kind of help about your specific situation and you want to talk to us about what's going on for you, go to CAIR.com, that's CAIR.com. Go to the report button there and you can fill out a form. Your form will go to your nearest CAIR chapter where an attorney or legal advocate who is who is available to help you will get back to you. We are all interested in helping you. So yeah, bring on the questions. Just don't put any specific personal private questions on there.
Absolutely. And just to add, if anybody likes to do things over the phone, you can always call our civil rights hotline at 202-742-6420. But let's get started. So religious accommodations in the workplace. Just a quick general overview of what that means is that federal law, protects individuals from employment discrimination. And employment discrimination can take a lot of different forms. It can be unfair treatment. It could be harassment by managers, coworkers, or other people in the workplace. It can be retaliation or denial of a reasonable workplace accommodation. Now, one of the protected statuses is, of course, religion, right? But we're talking about, protected status as race, color, religion, sex, which does include pregnancy, national origin, age discrimination, disability, and even genetic information at times, right? And that's the same protected statuses for all the categories I mentioned. For retaliation, you have to be taking action first before you're retaliated against. And one of the ways you take action is you take action that's protected under the law. For instance, requesting an accommodation is protected activity, right? Filing a discrimination claim, filing a lawsuit, participating in an investigation, participating in a lawsuit. Your employer is prohibited from retaliating against you for doing those protected activities. So our focus today is really going to try to focus on religious accommodations as opposed to, disability accommodations or other accommodations at the workplace, right? So I mentioned these protections and these prohibitions, right? And, that's in federal law. And so for federal law to apply, your employer has to be of a certain size, right? And generally speaking, if your employer has 15 or more employees, then it's going to be, the federal law is going to apply to you, and that's Title IX, okay? Otherwise, what you want to do is you want to call your state local CAIR chapter or an attorney to discuss your case specific, because state laws can protect more activities and it can cover more employers. So it's really important that if the information you take away from today is just informational and it's not legal advice. And so if you don't know if federal law applies to you, but state law may, make sure to contact an attorney or contact a local CAIR chapter so they can help you further. And so we're going to go through some specifics today, specifics in the law on how to request an accommodation. And then at the end, we're going to talk about scenarios, how to deal with certain scenarios, especially during Ramadan. But I'm going to hand it off to Sahara in CAIR, California to kind of talk about some of the specifics.
Sure. Thanks, Ahmed. So, by the way, folks, if you're tuned in, excuse us as we awkwardly go back and forth. This is the first time Ahmed and I have done a Facebook Live together, but he's one of my favorite colleagues. So, the other thing is I'm seeing some immigration questions coming in the comments section. So if you have immigration questions, those are great. Our folks are happy to handle them. Please go to CAIR.com. We won't be talking about immigration or travel in this conversation. So religious accommodation, right? That's the question is, I want something at work that makes it possible for me to both do my work and get paid for doing my work, but also practice my religion. So what does that mean? Can I say that I want to stay home from work for a whole year because my religion asks me for it? No, that's not a religious accommodation. So what is a religious accommodation? The law requires that an employer reasonably accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices, unless doing so would cause more than a minimal burden on the operations of the employer's business. So what is reasonable? Again, not staying home from work all year because your religion asks for it. Your religion likely does not ask for it. A reasonable accommodation is one that eliminates the employee's conflict between his or her religious practices and work requirements, and that does not cause an undue hardship for the employer. So an employer can't simply refuse to accommodate you. Like, they can't just say outright, no, absolutely not. You can't pray. You can't go to Eid. They can't say a flat out no. Rather, they're obligated to engage in a back and forth process with you. We call it an interactive process, and they have to do it in good faith as they attempt to resolve the conflict between your religious needs and the job requirements.
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight that it's really important that we remember that an employer is not mandated to provide the specific religious accommodation that you're requesting, right? As long as the employer has given you a reasonable accommodation, that's all the employer has to do. They don't have to grant the preferred accommodation that you want. And remember, that is true even if the preferred accommodation would not cause an undue burden to the employer.
So what's an undue burden, right? Like, I go back to this example of, like, can I say that I want to start work every day at 1 p.m. or can I take the whole year off? Or maybe not the whole year. Maybe I want 2 months off. I want a whole month of Ramadan off from work, and then I want the whole month of Shawwal. Now, fortunately, I've never received an employment complaint where someone has asked for those things. That would be an awkward conversation. So what is an undue hardship? Issues regarding religious accommodation are very fact sensitive. So they're going to depend on what your sincerely held belief is, where you work, what the circumstances of your job are, and even sort of how big the company is. So a company that has 200 employees may be able to accommodate more time off than a company that has 50. Now, both are over the threshold where they'd be required to give you some time off or make some sort of accommodation, but their ability is going to be really different. It's also going to be different depending on whether you're a police officer or you're a secretary, or maybe you work in the operating room at your local hospital. So issues regarding religious accommodation, as I've said, are very fact sensitive, but generally an undue hardship occurs if the employer would suffer costs more than the ordinary administrative costs. So again, if I'm going to take 2 months off and they have to hire a replacement for me, then maybe that's not reasonable and actually causes an undue hardship. The second criteria is that the accommodation diminishes efficiency in other jobs. So again, the surgeon takes the afternoon off in the middle of a surgery. Well, in a small hospital in a small town, that might not be possible, right? So again, like what changes? Can the nurses do their job if the doctor does or doesn't? How does that work? If it infringes on other employees' job rights or benefits. So let's say I showed up at work one day and I said, it's against my religion to work with Christian colleagues, right? Not a real thing. Don't mistake me for that. Muslims don't believe that. But let's say I showed up one day and I was like, I can't work with Christian colleagues. For my employer to accommodate me, they would have to infringe on the rights of their Christian employees. So that would cause an undue hardship. They can't do that. It impairs workplace safety. So this comes up a lot around, for example, security guards, firefighters, police officers, etc. Is what length of beard is going to be workable with the safety equipment. Yeah, I mean, I think yours is okay, Ahmed, but I'm not the beard expert. Alhamdulillah, that's one less thing I have to worry about. But here's the thing, right? With beards, the courts have actually often found that these employers can accommodate the beards. And so they're not going to be forced to have their employees shave their beards, but it is something that's been litigated a lot. So workplace safety. And then if proposed, the other accommodation conflicts with another law or regulation. So using the example of not working with Christian colleagues, if I said, hey, I'm a Hindu employee and I don't want to serve Muslim customers, right? Generally, the law is going to require that the business that I work at accommodate the Muslim customers coming in. And so an employer will not be required to accommodate my desire to not serve Muslim customers because they have other laws that they need to follow. So again, the standard is undue hardship. When I'm asking for an accommodation, my employer has to engage in an interactive process with me where I ask for something and we negotiate it. They have to do it in good faith. And the primary limit on what they give me is undue hardship. So if I want the earth, moon, and the sky, I may only get the earth because adding in the moon and the sky may be beyond the employer's capacity.
Yes, absolutely. It's very fact intensive, so it's really difficult to get precise definitions of what undue hardship means. And like we stated earlier, it's an interactive process. So it's really important that when you make a request for an accommodation, you should do your best to work with your employer to find an accommodation that works for everybody. That's the best case scenario. And so what we're going to do now is kind of move to talking about possible scenarios that you may encounter during the month of Ramadan.
Cool. And I want to reiterate, folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Our awesome colleague, Megan Fair, who is also at CAIR National, shout out to Megan, who helped coordinate all of this, is going through the questions. And so if something we're saying is not clear, or you're thinking about, hey, I know someone with this situation, or I want to figure out how to talk through this, feel free to ping us in the chat box. So Ramadan is coming up and you're like, okay, so what kinds of accommodations are requested or needed in Ramadan that we've seen before? Some examples are flexible scheduling. So If you pray tarawih, maybe you don't get home until 1 a.m. every night, but your usual work schedule is 7 to 4 or 7 to 5. You may talk to your employer about, can I come in later in the day? If you're thinking it doesn't make sense for me to be at work for 8.5 or 9 hours because I don't really need my lunch break. Though some people in Ramadan use their lunch break to nap, and I fully endorse that strategy. I often sleep in my car or sleep under my desk because that's how I get through the second half of the day. But maybe you don't want to take your lunch break and you want to go home earlier or adjust your shift. That's going to be another way that we'll talk through workplace scheduling. Other accommodation requests that we see in Ramadan are shift substitutions or swaps. So Eid is coming up. I don't want to work on Eid, and I endorse taking the full day off on Eid and partying hard and eating everything in sight, of course, totally in a halal manner. You have the opportunity to talk to your colleagues and your employer about, I'm scheduled to work on this day. Maybe can I swap it, right? Another thing, of course, is job reassignment. So maybe there's something that I do at work that I'm less inclined to do in Ramadan, whether it's food preparation versus actually bussing tables or seating people at tables if I work at a restaurant. There's a lot of different job reassignments that people think through in Ramadan. So that's another question. And then the last one is, of course, modification to workplace policies or practices. So that's really anything, right? Is your schedule, your attire. So we know, for example, some people who don't ordinarily wear beards or don't ordinarily wear hijabs choose to do so in Ramadan. So you may end up with a uniform question, whereas you've never had one before. And so that's a variety of what we've seen come up, and let's get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that we get sometimes when people call is, well, I want to make this religious accommodation request, but how do I go about doing it? And so what we always tell people is you should familiarize yourself with your employer's procedures on how to request religious accommodations. You really want to follow whatever procedure has already been laid out by your employer. Generally, big employers will have those procedures written down. There's like an employee handbook or something of that nature to kind of follow. Small employers, you may just have to, talk to a supervisor or someone in HR to kind of understand, how do I go about making a religious accommodations request. The second thing is it's really important that you make your request a formal request, either with your direct supervisor or whoever in HR is responsible for handling those types of issues. And then if you didn't make that formal request in writing, make sure to follow up in writing. We want to have, or you want to have some sort of evidence, some sort of documentation that you have made this request for a religious accommodation. And of course, it's an interactive process, so it's important that you continue, interacting with your employer, continue following up, work with your employer to make sure that he or she understands why you need the accommodation, and whether, what they're offering in return is going to be something that removes that conflict between your religious belief and the employer's, demands on your workplace. So I know we're talking about this all in the context of the month of Ramadan, but this applies year round, and these accommodations, most of these accommodations can apply year round as well. So don't just limit yourself to, this is the month of Ramadan because it's a holy month for, Muslims in this country and around the world.
The other thing I'll add is I think sometimes a misunderstanding is that people will just make the accommodation without having the conversation with their employer. So it's like, I have the right to the day off for Eid, so I'm just not going to show up to work on Eid, right? Make sure you're doing all of the things that Ahmed just outlined before you take the accommodation. That is not a defensible thing to do. You can't just not show up to work one day. So some quick helpful tips, and then we'll talk through specific scenarios. Make sure that you know your rights. And I want to be clear that there's a baseline at the federal level for what your rights are. But different states, including the beautiful California, where no one can afford a house, and yet we have earthquakes and amazing weather, beaches everywhere, has incredible workplace protections for employees. You are safest here as a worker than you might be anywhere else in the country. So the laws vary from state to state. Make sure you have a sense of what your rights are as an employee beyond just your employee handbook. We find that a lot of people think that everything that is in their employee handbook is the law and is absolute. But most maybe not most, maybe that's aggressive. A lot of employee handbooks don't have all of the information you need and are sometimes actually not even compliant with local and federal law. So get a sense of what your rights are, particularly if you look at your employee handbook and you're like, this feels really strangely restrictive and counter to what I heard Zahra and Ahmed blabbing about on Facebook. If you have questions about what your local laws are, reach out to your local CAIR office. When you are requesting the accommodation, it is really important that you cite the fact that your request is driven by your religious beliefs, right? So you want to be saying, I'm asking for this because of my sincerely held religious belief. You start to wear a headscarf at work. It's not for fashion. It's not for politics. It's for your sincerely held religious belief. You don't want to drink alcohol at a company event. It's because of your sincerely held religious belief. You want to take the day off for Eid. Sure, you're going to spend that time with family, but the request to your employer isn't, I want to spend time with family. It's, I have a sincerely held belief that this is a religious holiday, and so I'd like to request the time off from work. And then keep personal written records of how and when your request was made and whether it was accommodated. This is something that I tell young people a lot. Look, if you get into a car accident, it's a really traumatic thing. You're not going to remember all the details. So we tell you to take pictures and keep a written record. The same is true for when you are dealing with a workplace situation. You ask for an accommodation, maybe they grant it immediately, great, like make a positive note about that in your journal. But maybe they don't grant it. Maybe there are some disparaging questions that are asked, or maybe there's just some ambiguity and the employer needs a little bit more information. Not as traumatic as a car accident, fortunately, but still your ability to remember all of these instances is going to be challenging. So keeping a personal record of what's going on, when you asked for things and when you heard back is really important. As an example, I keep citing Eid because I strongly believe that no Muslim should go to work on Eid. That is not a CAIR opinion. It's not a legal opinion. It is a Zahra opinion. You should eat all of the desserts in the world on Eid. If you request the day off for Eid a month in advance, right, and you explain the lunar situation and the moon fighting in our community, and they don't get back to you until 2 days before, and then they say you made the request late, it's important that you have those records, right, that say, actually, I made this request a month ago. This is when I sent that email. So what you don't want to do, you don't want to be aggressive with your employer. Remember, I would say assume the best about your employer. In many, if not most cases, your employer is not intentionally trying to discriminate against you. Maybe they don't understand your request or they don't understand the law. So if you go from request to angry, 0 to 60 in 2 minutes, you are not going to be in a good position to engage what we call that interactive process. So don't get aggressive, don't get mad. Don't threaten to quit unless your request is accommodated. Do not give your employer an ultimatum. Like, that's not something that you do. Definitely never do it without consulting with an attorney. And I would be hard pressed to find an attorney who would tell you that you should threaten to quit at a first request, if ever. If and when you quit a job because you did not get an accommodation, it actually makes it more difficult for us to advocate on your behalf because at that point you're out of a job. It also impacts, by the way, things like unemployment. Don't give up if your request is not initially accommodated. So it takes some time. Again, there's a conversation, there's a process. Maybe your employer has never had a Muslim employee. Don't stop asking or going through that process just because they initially said no, right? You want to engage them. It is a back and forth and can take some time. And, you know, as a Muslim civil rights advocacy organization, we never want you to have to choose between your work and your ability to practice your faith. And so giving up either means you're going to, you know, quit your job or you're going to forego practicing your faith. And we don't want you to have to do those things. And then the last thing is something that I cited earlier. Do not wait until the last minute to make your request. Ask as early as you can. You know, using the moon sighting example, some of you may be thinking, we call it moon sighting, moon fighting. Some of you may be thinking, I can't request the day off for Eid until the night before because I don't know when Eid will be. But the reality is, look, when Ramadan starts, you know what two possible dates Eid will be on. And so you want to have a conversation with your employer early on and say, should I take both days off? Should I tell you the night before? But start that conversation early. The same is true for any uniform accommodations, any prayer time accommodations, or other things. Don't wait until the last minute. Don't do as some of us might call, don't ask for it on Muslim Standard Time.
Right. Very excellent points. And I just want to reemphasize that if your accommodation is declined, it's important that you don't react with quitting automatically. Make sure to file a civil rights complaint, with one of our offices, and get some legal advice first before moving forward. I mean, I'm noticing we have a question here from Nevin, and they ask, what if the employee gets the accommodation for Ramadan, but the manager still decides to schedule closing shifts or late shifts after Ramadan? I'm assuming, I'm not sure what he means by after Ramadan, but I'm assuming he means like that there's a conflict of some sort with Ramadan ritual that they're being scheduled. Maybe they can't break their fast, right? So it really depends on the accommodation that you get from your employer. But if your employer grants your accommodation and there's a conflict down the line, bring that conflict up with your employer. Let them know that, hey, I have this religious accommodation. My schedule conflicts with that accommodation, and try to work it out to get rescheduled, right? And sometimes one request for a religious accommodation may lead to another conflict. In those scenarios, just continue requesting an accommodation and work with your employer as we're talking about, right? Now, if we're talking about a situation where your accommodation is granted, you start using your accommodation, and then your manager is retaliating against you by giving you, poor shifts, then, you may be looking at you engaging in protected activity that's seeking the religious accommodation, using your religious accommodation, and then your employer is retaliating against you to make your workplace environment more negative for you. I would say in that instance, make sure to follow up with your HR to file the proper complaints. And then, of course, follow up by contacting either, CAIR National, filing a civil rights complaint online, calling our hotline, or contacting one of your local chapters or an attorney to get some advice, and so they can assist you. But you do have rights in those scenarios. You are protected under federal law and possibly state law, depending on what state you're in, from being retaliated against for engaging in the protected activity, which is seeking and taking the religious accommodation. Okay. I want to talk about specific scenarios real quick. And look, if you have further questions, just continue asking them, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. The first scenario, though, I want to talk about is breaking your fast, right? That's extremely difficult depending on the type of workplace environment that you're in. I want to discuss two separate scenarios. The first scenario, it's going to be really easy to kind of resolve, which is the office setting, right? Let's say you're like myself, you're an attorney, and you're working late hours regularly, and you need to be able to break your fast. How do you do it, right? You can get a religious accommodation. In that scenario, it works out pretty simple. You take a break during your office hours, and you break your fast, and you eat and you pray. Unfortunately, some scenarios, like working at a restaurant for servers, can be much more difficult, right? So let's say you're a server at a really busy small restaurant. It's only open for lunch and dinner. There's company policy that there's no eating or taking breaks while you're on shift. So normally you don't have that break period, to be able to break your fast. And the restaurant's very busy, and you work at a very busy time, and there's no other time for you to work, and there's nobody else for you to cover your shift, right? It's a small business, for instance. So what do you do in that instance, right? So what you need to do is, before Ramadan rolls around, you need to read and understand your employer's policy about eating while serving, right? It's really important. You don't want to go into Ramadan and break company policy when you haven't asked for a religious accommodation. Make sure that you define what your need is. What do you need from your employer in order for your religious belief to be accommodated so that you can break your fast? And so once you've done that, you want to make a formal request that your employer, the restaurant, they make an exception to the general policy that servers or anybody in the workplace, does not eat while they're at work, right? And so there, some solutions to that may be that you can snack really quick, snag a quick meal, when there's, some downtime, at a wait station in the kitchen, just kind of to break your fast and let you go about your work day. So you need to come up with a solution, come up with alternatives, and work with your employer to work out a solution that doesn't cause an undue hardship for the employer, but it allows you to, break your fast and maintain your religious beliefs. And of course, what are you going to do after you have this conversation, right? The employer grants you the accommodation, you need it in writing. So you want to follow up either with a note that you keep, with a letter, or if there's a company email or some sort of email that you can send your employer, send a follow-up email describing, how your accommodation is going to work. That way, if issues come up in the future, you have some evidence that, yes, you did request a religious accommodation and it was granted to you. And that way you have evidence of it, just in case something comes up in the future. The next scenario, go ahead.
No. Go.
No, I was going to introduce the next scenario is we just want to talk about, breaking your fast is one thing. Another huge issue that comes up is prayer. How do you pray?
Right. So I'm going to backtrack 1 second, and I know that there are some additional questions coming in. Sarah said, I was given notice by my boss that I couldn't break fast, that they won't accommodate me, no excuses, no religious reasons. And so that's a specific hypothetical. It may depend on what your job is, how you asked for it, and what you asked. And so again, Sarah, feel free to visit CAIR.com, submit an incident report. What's the button called, Ahmed? I should know this.
It's so there's a report a incident. It's on the top right of the CAIR.com website. It's in yellow, orange color. You can't miss it, and it takes you to a page that asks you, to fill in some information about your situation, how to contact you, where you live, and then that comes to us, via an email, and we respond to it, in a reasonable time frame.
Cool. So I actually just dropped the link in the comment section. Folks can see it. It's just cair.com/report. So that'll actually take, complications with buttons or website navigation. Just go to cair.com/report, put that in there, and someone can be in touch with you. I saw that there was also a question about, one of our offices and their decision to represent someone. Again, every case is fact specific. I always tell my community members in the Bay Area, if you want a second look at one of the decisions made by one of our team members, submit the form again, say I'd like a second look. If they declined to represent someone, it really could be very fact specific. I see that question coming in again. Maybe contact CAIR National directly for an individual follow-up. I don't want to make an assessment about that case or what that decision was on Facebook Live. And then the last question that I want to address in the interim is someone asked if this will be recorded and posted. Yes, it is being recorded now. It will be available online later. We hope that you will share it with folks and revisit it and leave us funny comments and little heart emojis, or laughing emojis or mad emojis, whatever you need to tell us as the video goes online. Okay, so that's all the interim stuff. Daily prayers. You work at an office building as a secretary. You wish to pray during the workday and need to take breaks during the day to pray, right? Now, some of you know that in the summers, you have a lot more time for Dhuhr prayer. In the winters, you have to get it all in really quickly. And by the time you leave work, the Dhuhr is already done for the day, right? And so maybe you're trying to figure out how to get your prayer times in, or maybe you start really early before Fajr comes in and you need to get Fajr in. So your office is a busy office, and the person you work for wants you to be available to take calls and talk to clients. Totally makes sense. You have a need to pray, and your employer has a need for you to be there at the front desk, to be the front line and answer the calls and open the doors. So it's important that you know your employer's policy, right? What does your employer's policy say about breaks? And remember, your employer's policy should also be compared with local law. So if you are a non-exempt employee, you are entitled by law to certain breaks, right? Are you classified correctly? It's very, I want to keep saying it's fact intensive, and it is. So know what your employer's policy is, but also check to see what local law is. Talk to your supervisor about the policy. So don't just assume that they won't grant you the break or that they will, right? You want to have a conversation with them about the policy. Prayer in general, at its bare minimum, can be done in 5 to 10 minutes, right? So maybe you don't get to pray an extended Tarawih prayer in the middle of the workday, which is good because most people don't pray Tarawih prayer at 2 p.m. So prayer is not very long. You might be able to work with your supervisor to get another team member to cover your desk during that time. Or, maybe you shift your lunch so that it overlaps with prayer. So if I ordinarily take my lunch from 11:30 to 12:15, but Dhuhr doesn't come in till 12:30, maybe I can work with my employer to shift the lunch. Put the request in and follow up in writing. So depending on your relationship with your employer, I know when my staff needs something from me, it definitely helps if it starts as a verbal conversation. I do this with my supervisors, and I ask my staff to do it with me. Follow up in writing, because if all we're relying on is our verbal conversation, then we may remember different things about it. I mean, Ahmed and Megan and I coordinated for this Facebook Live several times, but Megan always followed up with us in writing because she didn't want to take the chance that Ahmed thought we were doing one thing and Zahra thought we were doing another thing. So even internally as a best practice, we follow up in writing. So you want to talk to your employer about your accommodations for prayer. After you have that conversation, make sure that you follow up in writing.
Absolutely. And I want to reemphasize, and I'll give a quick example about the importance of following up in writing. Even if you have a good relationship with your employer, you don't know when that relationship will, turn sour or anything of that nature. I mean, right now we have a case where we're litigating the issue about what did the employee ask for, right? Obviously, we're saying, oh, they asked for a religious accommodation in general. The employer is responding with, no, they only asked for a religious accommodation limited to the month of Ramadan, right? Exactly what we're talking about here. And prayer is a really good example of it. You want a prayer accommodation for the whole year because you have to pray prayer every single day. It's not going to be limited to just Ramadan. But if you happen to ask for it during Ramadan, your employer, may have a misconception that you're just asking for this month. Getting it in writing will help clear up some of those, misinterpretations, miscommunications, or misremembrance that may come up in the future. So it's really important to do that in writing always. We're going to continue to repeat it because it's that important. The next scenario we want to kind of discuss is, how to take days off for religious purposes, or how to take, maybe an afternoon or an hour or two off so you can do Jum'ah prayer, right, and go to the mosque, the masjid. There's really several ways for you to accomplish this in the workplace, and it's gonna depend on how your workplace is structured. A great way that I saw this being implemented, that an employee actually came up with for taking 2 or 3 hours off so that she could go to Jum'ah, was that throughout the week she suggested, and it was granted, that she shorten her lunch break. Normally she would get 30 minutes a day, so she shortened her lunch break Monday through Thursday to about 15 minutes. That way she could still be working the 40 hours that's required of her. And on Friday, she had gained all of this extra lunchtime that she would just add up, to add up her 2 hours, because nobody wants to stay late on a Friday afternoon, right? Another way you can do it is you can work extra hours on the other days, so that you can take an hour or two extra to go to Jum'ah prayer, right? But the best way to do all this is, how are you going to request this accommodation? Is that you have to ask for it in advance, right? Asking, the Friday of Jum'ah, right, an hour before you want to go, may pose a lot of difficulties and hardships for that employer, right? They may not have your shift covered. They may need those phones answered, while you're gone, and that might not be feasible for them. But doing it in advance, it allows them to plan ahead to do that. Taking a day off can be a little bit different, right? You may not be able to shorten or lengthen your other days enough to be able to take a whole day off. So what you want to do in advance is make the request, like for Eid that's coming up. You know which day or two that Eid may fall on. So let your employer know now, or 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, whatever you think is reasonable before Eid actually occurs, and make that request. And you can use, paid time off. You can use vacation hours, whatever hours you've accumulated in order for you to take that day off. You may have to use one of those days that you might be saving up for a vacation, right? But just make sure that when you're making that religious accommodations request, that you're telling your employer you're doing it because you have a sincerely held religious belief, and of course that it's conflicting with some sort of work obligation that you may have. So it's really important that you do that in advance, because sometimes it may be difficult for your employer to to work around a situation where you won't be there for an entire day. Okay.
Cool. So it's hard to tell if you're taking a breath or so I can jump in.
Yeah. There's a little delay. I understand.
No. It's cool. That's why I told folks it might be a little bit awkward because I haven't done it with Ahmed before. So we're gonna transition to schools, but just to summarize how we get through workplace accommodations in Ramadan, but also generally a few things. And I saw actually someone just asked a question about university students' rights, so we're going to get to that as we talk through schools. How do you get through your religious accommodations? The first thing, of course, is to remember that federal law and state law prohibit discrimination in the workplace. It is really important that you know your rights, that you ask your employer to make those accommodations for you, and that you ask in compliance with the policy. So something, by the way, that we skipped over is that different employers, based on different sizes and situations, may even have different ways of asking, right? So maybe you go to HR. Maybe if you're a smaller business, you go straight to your manager. And so think about that. Write everything down. So don't leave it to your memory or their memory. And then contact your local CAIR chapter for more help. So you have questions, concerns, reach out to CAIR. You can do that at cair.com/report. If you don't know where your local office is, if you go to that website, we'll direct your complaint to your nearest office. And so let's jump into schools really quickly so we stay on time.
Yeah, and so we're going to try to cover similar talking points or similar points about schools, but they're going to be a little bit different because of the school environment. And so, yes, students do have rights at schools. They have, First Amendment rights, although sometimes those could be limited depending on the school environment. Let's talk about really specific about Ramadan. Right after Ramadan is Eid, right? Religious holidays. Can your child take Eid off? And the answer is yes, they can. Schools cannot penalize students for missing a day or two for religious holidays, right? It's a religious reason. But what you have to do is you have to request in advance the day off by contacting your school, right? Let the principal know, let the teachers know ahead of time and in writing, because it's really important to follow up in writing, okay? Prayer also comes up. in schools, how does my child take a break to pray? And so your child does have the right to take short breaks for daily prayers.
So you have the right to take breaks for prayers. You may be able to get a break for Jummah prayers in certain circumstances, but you may also have to coordinate that with school officials, right? So unless there's, my brother and I were the only practicing Muslims, visible practicing Muslims at my public school growing up. These days, there are some schools that have like 50 Muslim students at them, which sounds amazing and maybe stressful in other ways. So maybe you have Jummah prayer on campus, but if you're like my brother and I, you're going to need to leave campus for Jummah prayer. You can't just get up and leave, and you also just can't organize an activity with 50 students without talking to anyone else. And so make sure that you are coordinating with your teachers and your administrators. Someone asked, by the way, about what should university students do in these circumstances? University students have a lot more flexibility because you pick your class timings. And so in general, throughout college, we advise people to not pick classes at Jummah time because you're going to need to miss that once a week. If you need to miss university class for Eid, same process as you would apply for the workplace and really even for schools. You're going to want to talk to your professor. Your professor may require you to escalate it. But in general, they can't penalize you for taking time off to pray. But don't schedule a class at Jummah time because you'll miss it every week. And then they're going to say, hey, you need to take another class. Student-led prayer in general, both at schools and universities, is allowed so long as it's not disruptive. And schools will need to be reasonable in determining what is disruptive. So sure, if you want to put down your prayer mat and organize 20 people in the middle of biology class, that's going to be disruptive. You want to use an empty classroom, a library, or the playground. It's been so long since I've been on a playground. A playground or field for your prayers, that's going to work and make sense. A school is not required to provide a designated prayer room for you. So you don't get to have your own musalla at your university or even at your school. They just have to give you somewhere that is available. And they have to be reasonable in doing so. So if they say, hey, we need you to pray in the trash room, you're going to say, that is the one place Muslims can't pray. We don't pray in restrooms or trash areas because we want to pray in clean places. And so that can be a library, it can be an empty classroom, it can be someone's office. And so you don't necessarily get to have your own prayer room. And we've seen, by the way, this conversation happen a lot at universities. And so you can get a meditation room, a quiet room, but they're not going to be required to give you, a Muslim, a specific place that is only yours.
Right. And I want to touch on a little bit of accommodation requests that are specific to Ramadan. I know when I was in school, going to lunch was really difficult during Ramadan, right? Watching all the other students eat when you can't, and that can, have an impact on your day. So, if that scenario is something you want to avoid, talk to your school and request that, maybe you can go to the school library or there's another safe space in your school that you can go to and kind of spend lunchtime at, maybe to take a nap, to kind of re-energize yourself instead of going to the cafeteria during lunch, right? It's really important that, you give your school advance notice and talk to them about the issues that you're going to face, those type of issues. Another issue that comes up during that time is, I remember, you're in PE, right? Physical education. There's a lot of strenuous activities, that happen during that time. You want to avoid it. Make sure to let your school know that you be excused, from strenuous physical activity for religious reasons, and see if there's a way that the school can, accommodate you with that. Maybe it's doing other type of work instead of, running around the gym or playing basketball or something of that nature. Another thing you want to be cognizant of is looking ahead, knowing like when your class schedule is. Students may have exams during specific times that you're trying to request an accommodation. For instance, let's say you want a prayer break at not 3 o'clock, but let's say 1 o'clock while school is ongoing. But there's a huge test that's occurring during that time. So that might make it more difficult for you to get your prayer accommodation on that day. So look forward in advance and let your school know about things. For college students, there's more flexibility about how you choose your classes. And I'm seeing a question come up from Asma. It's a fake question, apparently.
But it's actually a good one. I know.
I'll let you take it.
For those that are wondering, right? So Asma is a colleague of ours, and her and I have been debating American chocolate, European chocolate, store-bought chocolate, fancy chocolate. It's it's really important things in the world of civil rights. Particularly, I don't drink alcohol, so I need coping mechanisms, and chocolate is mine. And so her question is, what if your employer believes that you should break your fast with European chocolates and you're like, I want to break it with American chocolates? She's joking, but here's the takeaway from it. Your employer does not get to tell you what your sincerely held religious belief is. That is entirely up to you. Your employer doesn't get to tell it to you. The courts don't get to tell it to you. And to be honest, CAIR doesn't even get to tell it to you. Now, we may tell you what is a reasonable accommodation. So, hypothetically, you need time to fry samosas at work so that you can break your fast with samosas. The South Asians will get this, right? And your employer's like, I'm not going to provide you with an instant fryer and 30 minutes to cook fresh food. You should break it with jamba juice and some dates, right? You don't have maybe you have a sincerely held religious belief on the samosas, right? But you and your employer are going to go back and forth on what is reasonable and what can be provided. So employer says European chocolates, you say American chocolates. You're probably going to land on generic store-bought chocolates because that's what's going to be most efficient to get you back to work quickly. I don't know if that made sense. I was trying to make sense of it. Thanks, Esma.
No, that was great, and I'm glad that we're kind of at the end here, so it's good to end on a light note. If there are any other questions, please ask them now. To wrap up, it's really important, and I'll bring these back up again. Make the request in writing, follow up in writing, make the request in advance, and make sure that you're engaging your employer in an interactive process of going back and forth, so that way that you get a religious accommodation that works best for you and that also works for your employer as well. And if you're not able to do that, you should go on the internet, go to cair.com/report and file a civil rights complaint with our office, or call us at 202-742-6440. Or if you already know your phone number to your local chapter, give them a call. They'll love to talk to you and kind of, understand your situation and see if there's ways that we can help you. All right. I don't see any questions on my end. Are there questions showing up on yours?
I'm not seeing any additional questions, so thank you everyone for tuning in, to Ahmed for anchoring us, and Megan for coordinating. We'll see you guys next time, inshallah.
All right, thank you guys. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. I think you need to end.